Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another podcast. Again, thank you for tuning in one more week. Before we get started, make sure you go to www.flippingthebarrel.com, put your email on there so you can stay up to date with everything FTB. We've got a lot of plans, a lot of events, a lot of really great episodes coming out. So make sure you do not skip a beat on anything FTB. Today's podcast, we're super excited to have Alex Epstein on. It's been many months that we've been, hoping to get a conversation with him. He's super busy, so we're really glad to finally get him on today to just find out a little bit more about his work, about us being in energy and how important a lot of the topics that he's talking about, and also just educating ourselves on how we can be better at advocating for our own industry. So a little bit about Alex. He's a philosopher and energy expert who argues that the human flourishing should be the guiding principle of energy and environmental progress. He is the author of the new best-selling book, Fossil Future: Why Global Human Flourishing Requires More Oil, Coal, and Natural Gas, Not Less. He is also the creator of EnergyTalkingPoints.com, a source of powerful, well-referenced talking points on energy, environmental, and climate issues. This is really handy because as energy workers, we are always constantly battling this. So that's a really good website to find out a little bit more about how you can, talk about energy. He's widely recognized as a master of persuasion and debate on energy issues. Alex has spoken at dozens of Fortune 500 companies and dozens of prominent universities, including Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Duke, his alma mater. So the fact that you're on Flipping the Barrel today and we're part of one of those on the list, we're super grateful. So Alex, thank you for being here today.
Hey, my pleasure.
So, Alex, we feel like we know you. We have listened to all your podcasts. We've read your material. We see you on the news, on CNBC, on Fox, everywhere advocating. But what we really don't know is like who Alex is. We would really like to just kind of first get our listeners an understanding of like where you grew up, where you were from, like, and how you became who you are today, and especially in energy. And was there a certain moment in your life where you decided to take this journey, and then start writing your books?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I probably more than most people think of people as who they are based on how they think and what they do. So I do feel like people know me a lot from just how I approach these issues. But I guess part of it is the way I approach energy is the way I approach a lot of things, in the sense of I try to approach things in a way that's thinking very carefully about what's true, and then being very pro what I would call flourishing. So being really interested both with myself and my friends and family and everyone is like, okay, you have a very limited amount of time on earth. Like, how can that be really good, including live a long time, enjoy it, et cetera. And kind of one of my beliefs for a long time is just that people don't think enough about their life, and they don't take seriously the fact that it's very short. And so I'm very, in energy, I focus a lot on this, but it's kind of the same thing everywhere. So that's kind of how I think of myself in general. And so if somebody knew me personally, I think they would think similarly. Like if I was talking to them personally, I'd be talking about, hey, what can you do as an individual to flourish? Since I talk about energy professionally, I talk about what humanity can do. In terms of my background, so I grew up in a place called Chevy Chase, Maryland. So none of my background lends itself at all toward being pro fossil fuels. It actually lends itself in the opposite direction, because I grew up in a kind of politically liberal place, no family background, didn't know anyone in the industry, only heard negative things about fossil fuels, particularly because I had a strong math science background, some in college, but particularly in high school. I went to one of the top math science, computer science high schools in the country. And in general, in those environments, they tend to be very hostile to fossil fuels and only focus on negatives and not positives. And that was certainly my experience. So I had the experience of, hey, fossil fuels are this thing that's destroying the world. And that's all I, quote, learned. So kind of none of that would really lend itself toward being pro fossil fuels, quite the opposite. But I would say that, one of the benefits of my upbringing, my parents and my three sisters, is I grew up in an environment where we're just sort of immersed in thinking logically Both of my parents kind of have strong academic, intellectual backgrounds, and they never pushed politics on me at all, which I'm grateful for. But I think just I was around them who were very smart, and my siblings were very smart. And then I got to be around a lot of smart people. So that just helped me think logically in general and really value logical thinking. And then when I was a teenager, I really fell in love with philosophy, which for me was the turning point, because philosophy, I always loved math and science. But I actually loved philosophy more once I realized what it was, because math and science, you're thinking logically about quantitative issues and about sort of the physical world. But in philosophy, you're thinking logically about how to think about everything. And then you're thinking logically about human life, which I found that I was most interested in that. Like whatever was interesting in math and the physical sciences, I found human beings and human action much more interesting. And sort of that led me to be very aware of how people are thinking about things. Are they thinking about things in a pro-human way or not? And that ultimately led me to decide, to realize when I learned a little bit about energy, that the way we're thinking about energy to me doesn't make any sense, because our dominant form of energy, fossil fuels, we tend to only look at negative side effects and not benefits. And to me, that's as absurd as only looking at the negative side effects of the polio vaccine, not the benefits. And so that's some of my background and how it shaped how I think about energy.
That's really interesting. So you studied philosophy at Duke University. Like you mentioned, you found out that that was one of your passions. What were your plans after graduating? And did you ever think you wanted to write books? Not necessarily about this topic, but were you like a writer growing up? And did you see publishing a book in your vision, or this just kind of happened afterwards?
So a couple of things. One is, when people hear that I went to Duke and studied philosophy, they have one of two reactions, neither of which is accurate. So one is they'll say, well, that's not very impressive because you just studied philosophy. So how do you know anything about energy? And you only got a bachelor's degree in philosophy. Sometimes they know I also studied computer science. And then the other reaction is, oh, you learned about philosophy at Duke. And the truth is really neither of these. I'm not really a school person. I think if I grew up in today's era, I would not go to college at all. At the time, for me, it was bold to not pursue a graduate degree. Like that was considered incredibly controversial in the environment I was in. Once I decided I wanted to be what I call a practical philosopher, like people were saying, you can't do, nobody will ever pay attention to you unless you get a PhD in philosophy. And my view was, well, PhD, given I have a lot of negative views about the state of philosophy in universities, I thought this would be at best a waste of time for the most part, and at worst, I thought I would develop bad habits, because I think most philosophers, not all, but most philosophers today are very detached from reality and do not create much of value, which is why philosophy has the reputation of being a pretty useless field. So I thought, well, the best thing is if the school isn't really necessary, then you should just go do the thing. And so for me, the thing was I wanted to be what I call a practical philosopher. And that involved, I didn't know what I would focus on. I definitely thought it was not in my mind at all. I would focus on energy because I didn't know anything about energy, and certainly not fossil fuels, because I had heard fossil fuels were bad. And I wasn't super hostile, but had no enthusiasm at all. But I did realize that when I was 20, I think when I made this decision, because I had wanted to be a tech entrepreneur. That's why I was in computer science in the first place. And I decided it was really hard for me because I hated the idea of being a writer. Like most writers, there are a lot of people who want to be a writer and think that's really cool. And a lot of writers are that way. They always wanted to be a writer. And I never wanted to be a writer. I thought writers were losers. And I thought anyone who talked about ideas was a loser, because what I respected was physical accompliment. So I liked athletes, and I liked business people, and I liked engineers. Like the stuff you guys are doing, I wasn't into fossil fuels, but I like doing things in the world. And I was very suspicious of people who were just kind of academics and talking. So it's pretty ironic that, now I make my living in ideas and talking. But the thing that I realized for me was that for me, actually, the ideas are the most practical thing, including physically practical. And I could see that the ideas people have about how to think and act have huge consequences in physical reality. And that totally bore out with fossil fuels, where people thinking that fossil fuels are evil has led to things like a global energy crisis. And so once I realized that philosophy was practical and writing was practical, that allowed me to embrace my love of it, which I had always had. I had always really enjoyed it, but it was sort of a guilty pleasure And then it's, oh, I can actually do this for a living and feel good about it because I'm actually accomplishing something.
Well, it's actually really interesting where you started and your thoughts on philosophy and writing and just academics in general to really you becoming an expert in this. I'd like to go back to one of the things you talked about in your books. One of the things I've also heard on a podcast, you talked about these discussion points called oil walks, where you like go around and you actually tell somebody about all the things that are made of oil. When did you start these? And was this part of your education too, when you decided that energy is something that I need to be an advocate for and like look at what all oil and fossil fuels create around us? Or when was that turning point for you to start discussing this as as intense as you do today?
So it really began with, I became interested in energy in 2007. And it was just a very weird origin. So I was doing practical philosophy of about a lot of things. And the short version is I was teaching a course on the history of business journalism and sort of how bad it was. And one of the things I had a suspicion from stuff I had heard was that the story of Rockefeller was very distorted. So I had to learn the history of Rockefeller. And then to understand him, I needed to understand the history of the oil industry. And then understanding the history of the oil industry, I realized how bad life was before oil and how good the oil industry made it very, very quickly. So there was this quote that really struck me from 1864, which is just 5 years after the inception of the oil industry. And they were talking about basically the countryside used to be dark and now it's light. And it was just because they discovered this way of harnessing energy. They had other ways, but they discovered one that was so cost effective that actually the poorer people on the countryside could use it versus the, say, 6 previous alternatives like whale oil and certain forms of plant oils, like similar to modern ethanol, not oils, alcohols, I should say, for ethanol. And so it's just this uniquely cost effective form of energy radically changed life. And so that really made me appreciate the value of energy to human life, and in particular, the value of cost-effective energy. And that made me excited about it. Now, I just forgot what was the rest of your question? Oh, you're asking me how I got into it?
I asked
And
you
what
about
else?
the oil, like, yeah, how you got into it. And
Oh,
then
the oil walks,
the oil
Yes,
walk.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. So by that, at that point, I had no real appreciation of energy. I mean, I occasionally write about it as part of my commentary, but I had no depth at all. And part of what I learned in the history of oil was the phenomenon of these petroleum products. And this is one of the things, one of the many good things Rockefeller did in his pursuit of efficiency is he figured out how to make you guys are flipping the barrel, but it's like he figured out how to make use of the entire barrel, or huge amounts of it, and turn a huge amount of what had been waste into wealth. And you start learning about petroleum products, and then you learn that in the modern context, you have these amazing chemical processes and engineers who can break down oil into these very small monomers, and you can build them up into polymers. And I started realizing that oil was physically in, or also natural gas was physically in so many of the things in the world. And I found this fascinating. And I thought, well, other people don't know this either. And so I would first start myself, but then I would communicate this in events that I would start to do. I would just look around and wake up in the morning and think about, hey, what here is made possible by oil? And of course, there's everything that's produced using oil-powered machines, but even leaving that aside, the physical thing. So I would just tell a version of the story. Okay, I wake up and I'm groggy and it's my alarm clock, and I hit the alarm clock and I realize, why aren't I afraid that I'm going to get electrocuted by this electrical device? And the idea was, well, because it's got this insulated cable. What is that made of? Is it made of trees? Is it made of, no, it's like, it's made of oil. That stuff that was, we see in an oil spill. And you sort of go through it. It's like, oh, wait, my bed, it's a sleep number bed. What is that made of? That's oil. And then, oh no, I have a Tempur-Pedic bed. Wait, that's oil too. And like, you just go through everything and you see, oh, the carpet is based on oil, and the paint is based on oil, and the insulation is based on oil, and your shower is made of oil, and your car has all this oil in it. And you just sort of see, wow, the whole world is made up of these amazingly cost-effective materials, and they're not made of anything that we relate to in our daily life. Like they're not rocks, and they're not glass, and they're not plants, including they're not wood. And you just think, where does this come from? And it's, oh my gosh, it comes from this industry that I've been taught is totally unnecessary and harmful. And so that made it very real to me. And it also made it real to others. And I just found that this really resonated with people this aha. And I remember I think in 2010, I was trying to come up with a Halloween costume. and I ended up being big oil. And so I just took a jacket and I put like duct tape on it that said big oil. And I just had a backpack full of petroleum products. And it was one of my most popular costumes ever because I just showed people all this stuff is made of oil.
Yeah, I think it's so many misconceptions about the industry, and we get it a lot too, where people from outside of the industry, they just say like, you work for the bad guys, you guys pollute the world, you're bad, but then they have multiple cars in their driveway and they're ordering stuff on Amazon all day, and it's like they don't understand that what they're trashing is what powers their lights on, and what so much of that. But as an industry, we haven't done a good job in overall the years that we've been in doing this. What is something that you think more executives and more people who have the power in energy to kind of advocate for us? Because not a lot of people are. If anything, we kind of try to hide the fact that we're oil and gas now, especially with a lot of pushes in different sectors of renewables and ESG and green. And there's only a few. I can mention like Chris Wright. He's one of the only one that I can think of that's really proud about oil and gas. What's something, and I think that's why you probably did the energytalkingpoints.com. What is something that we can do, but maybe a message that you have for leaders who are the leaders of these companies that aren't talking about how great this industry is?
So I'm going to give you my most controversial idea. The easiest thing is go to energytalkingpoints.com and all my stuff is there. But I thought of this example years ago, and it really struck me as making a point that I think is important to make. And it can be a hard point for people in industry to hear, and it actually involves the coal industry, but exactly applies to the oil industry. So what I noticed about the coal industry is the coal industry has this amazing history of having these coal miners who are very, very morally confident. And if you threaten the wages of the coal miners, they'll stand up and they'll protest, and they're this fearsome political bloc. But yet, starting in the mid 2000s, particularly with President Obama's emergence, like there was this idea of, I'm going to get rid of the coal industry. The coal industry is evil. We're going to make you extinct. And what was so notable to me was the coal industry that had once been so powerful in defending, 10 cents an hour in wages was silent when attacked in terms of its very existence. And what that shows is that it's not fundamentally that it's an industry that lacks communication skills. There's something internal where they lack the confidence in their very existence that they had in their wages in terms of laborers. Because the wages thing is often, the boss is screwing us and we're not making enough money and we should make more. Like they had confidence as wage earners, but not at the core as coal producers. And a lot of it is they have been gutted by this idea that what they do is this planet destroying thing. And a lot of that is the society is only looking at the negatives of what they do and exaggerating them and then ignoring the positives. And so my belief, it really convinced me that the core thing is internal clarity. Like the core thing is that you have total conviction that what you do is really good. And when you have conviction, you stand up with courage, but it doesn't feel like courage. And I don't know if you guys have seen this footage of me in New York City with the I Love Fossil Fuels sign and the I Love Fossil Fuels shirt, standing up, and there are 300,000 people marching down the street. And I'm giving them lectures on how good fossil fuels are. And people say to me all the time, I would never do that. It takes so much courage, blah, blah, blah. And maybe you shouldn't do it today because unfortunately violence is more normalized than it was in 2014. Yeah. But in any case, for me, it didn't feel like courage. It just felt like this is obviously wrong what these guys are saying, and I know they're wrong, and so I'm going to say it. And it's the same thing I feel like if there is an epidemic of racism in my area, I would stand up and I would fight against it. And if I'm totally clear on something being wrong and something being right, it's almost impossible not to say something. So I think the industry, the number one thing is having moral clarity about the goodness of what you do and overcoming a lot of the bad ways of thinking. And that's where, Fossil Future, which you can see behind me and here, like, I think that's the number one thing. If you have the time and you can pay $20 on Amazon or buy it for your employees, that is the best thing. But energytalkingpoints.com has plenty, including a really good summary of Fossil Future by me. But I think it's that internal confidence. And then once you have that, it makes so much of a difference. I think that's like you guys, I'm sure it's a big thing. Like, why are you guys standing up? And part has to do with confidence. And then part of it, when you have that understanding, it's pretty easy to talk about it. But I would say on top of that, then I've made all the arguments super easy to access, and I've given all the facts. And this is what Energy Talking Points does. It takes people, it persuades people who are unpersuaded, but it also takes people who are supporters, and it allows them to be champions by giving them just super compact, well-referenced things for every situation. Because even if you have confidence, you're not spending every moment of every day thinking about how to communicate these issues, which I am and have been doing for 15 years. So that I'm trying to translate that ability by giving you literally what to say about every situation. So those two things, the confidence and then the concrete things to say, I think will make a big difference. But if I had to choose one, I would choose the confidence.
No, I think that that is so valid and true. And the confidence of being able to be out there and be vulnerable, because you will be in those situations. But you have to understand what your why is. And so I think it's important to understand that while you're out there advocating for your industry. So thank you for sharing that and sharing those resources. I'd like to kind of turn it to education, because we do see, especially in North America, where our education system, especially at a very young age, they're teaching young children that fossil fuels are not the future. And they even do it in cartoons. I've seen it when I watch my daughter's shows, where they even make us out where even the youngest minds are already starting to get embedded that fossil fuels shouldn't be the future. What can we do about that? And I know, the first thing is we could advocate with the schools and the boards, but how can we change the perception of the younger generation who really thrives on instant gratification? And the only way to really get instant gratification and success is because of where we've gotten with fossil fuels and having the opportunities that we have to have today. You even said it in your book that, the success of people is directly related to oil and gas, but yet we fail so widely on the younger generation on teaching them that, what can we do, and what's your advice when it comes to that?
So this is a problem I don't have a complete solution for. The part that's easiest, if you're talking about people who are, say, 13 and above, a lot of the stuff that I've created is useful for them. So I put out a lot on social media. A lot of it is on energytalkingpoints.com. So kind of with any issue, you can give them that and talk them through that, or share that with them. And it's useful. The indoctrination at a very young age is much more difficult to deal with, in part because I don't know of any really good resources that counter it. And I get asked, this is probably the number one question I get asked from industry, is sort of, what do we do about kids? And my answer is always, if somebody is really actively working on this, I'm happy to help them with it. But it's its own project to figure that out. But I have a very basic piece of advice that I think is helpful certainly for parents and for anyone dealing with this, which is, you need to think about what is the most important thing for people to realize. And I think people who are, let's say, in the oil and gas industry, their tendency is, I need to tell them a bunch of positive things about oil and gas. And that is true, but I don't think it's nearly the most important point. The most important point is to teach people what life was like before what is commonly called industrialization, but we can call it, before we had energy abundance. And I talk a lot about this. I talk a lot about this in chapter 4 of Fossil Future, just that the world, absent energy and machines, is a barely livable place. It cannot support many people, and it supports them at a very low level. So I describe it as, it's deficient and it's dangerous. And the only way it has become abundant and safe is by using machines to do a huge amount of work for us, because we're weak. So the planet is naturally deficient and dangerous. We're weak. So unless we overcome our weakness, we're going to be very poor and die early. And so what we do with energy is we power machines that allow us to do, say in the US, 75 times more work than we can do with our meager physical bodies. And if people get what life was like before widespread energy and machine use, and then after, what happens is they stop glorifying, quote, the environment as this perfect place that we can only ruin. And that the fear is, oh, we're going to ruin it. And they start to think, no, the thing you should be afraid of is not having energy, because energy is what makes your environment good. And you mentioned that, like, people's instant gratification lifestyles made possible by fossil fuels, but the more they understand how bad life is without fossil fuels or their equivalent, the better. And then you can talk about the specific role of oil and gas. But people really need to be afraid of a natural world, and versus what they're taught now is to be afraid of an unnatural. But no, you live in a very unnatural world, and that for the most part is a good thing. And as I point out, part of this quote unquote unnatural world, which is not, it's wrong to really call it unnatural, because we are natural. So human beings building a house is like a beaver building a dam. That's not an unnatural thing. But if you use unnatural in terms of human made, part of that is you get to enjoy nature. You don't get to enjoy nature much in a quote natural world where you're scraping by for your survival.
Mm. No, totally agree. I really like the way you put it. I have a question on what are your thoughts on energy transition / energy expansion and renewables? For example, I work in energy. I'm very proud of it. But at the same time, obviously, I care for the planet. It's not because you work in it that all of a sudden you don't. So anything that has to do with recycling, using less plastic, if I could put solar panels on my house and it's going to help me out with renewables, sure. So it's kind of like not one's totally bad, one's good. What is your thought on like that mix for the future? And I'm not saying like, those big energy panels that just take up farmland and things like that, but like basic stuff, like I can put it on my house and I can save some water if I do like kind of living a good kind of like I'm doing good for the planet, but I also know that energy, like fossil fuels are important. Like, is there a balance?
So I think of it more as there's a synthesis of it that's better. So I talk a lot in Fossil Future about this idea of advancing human flourishing as the goal that we should be focused on when we're thinking about the world and including the plant, if we're thinking about it as the planet. And so part of it is when you talk about it, well, I want to do like, okay, this is good for me and this is good for the planet. But what does the planet mean? Like the planet kind of is this vague term and it often means non-human nature. But do I want to do things for non-human nature? I would say no and yes. Like, I don't want to sacrifice. Like, do I want to sacrifice? Because if I really want to serve the planet, well, should I sacrifice myself to the malarial mosquito? Like, would that help, quote, the planet? So when you're using the planet, it just basically means everything that's not us. That's the common usage. And I think that's a very problematic term. So the way I think of it is, I don't do things for the planet. I want the planet to be the most livable place for human beings to flourish. And part of that is, yeah, you want it to be as clean as possible, all things being equal. And you want it to be as safe as possible. And you want lots of, you want the animals that we like, at least. Like you want to be able to enjoy the cool ones and you want to have pets and you want to be able to enjoy parks and stuff, but you want to be insulated from the dangers. You don't want the malarial mosquito, at least you don't want it near you. And you don't want the polar bear unimpeded near you, but you want to look at it. So I think of it as, I want the most hospitable planet possible for humans. And that includes having, a pro-human relationship with the rest of nature, which sometimes means we promote it. Like I promote Sherlock, my dog's life, unnaturally much. Like he has no chance in nature. And yet I give him and my fiance, like we give him a good life, right? So some parts of the rest of nature you promote, some you're kind of indifferent to, some you want to cordon off like a polar bear. It's beautiful. It's my favorite animal aesthetically, but I don't want it next to me like I do my dog. And some you oppose like the malaria mosquito. So I think the key is to think about our environment and the world in a consistently pro-human way. And sometimes that means impacting things a lot. And sometimes that means impacting things less. But if you think of it in terms of impact the planet is good, not impact the planet is bad, that's a mess because then you refrain from doing things that are good for you. And this is a lot of why the industry lacks confidence is because they have this idea that our impact is bad and everyone knows industry impacts a lot. So they feel like, oh, there's this guilt underlying everything. Whereas my view is you shouldn't feel guilt for taking a bunch of glop from under the ground and turning it into a bulletproof vest. That is an improvement in the planet. So my first book, this short little book of essays, is called Fossil Fuels Improve the Planet. And so from a human perspective, I think impacting the planet generally improves it. And you want to avoid the impacts that don't, but it's all from a human perspective. You want the earth to be as hospitable as possible for us, just as a lion wants it to be as hospitable as possible for the lion. But there are conflicts of interest among species. And when those conflicts exist, I choose humans.
I love how you put that, especially when you talked about your dog. I think a lot of people can relate to that. I would like to ask you though, there's a lot of arguments, of course, on the other side. And the way that you speak about it, and of course, what Massiel and I align with, it's like, why do people not understand that fossil fuels really are what drives humanity? And there's enough documents out of there, there's enough people speaking about it, but yet we even see like governments decide against us. We have policies against us. What is the reasoning for that when we know deep down that we cannot survive without fossil fuels? They are part of our daily lives of just survival mechanisms, from, as you mentioned, machines to advancement in technology. You can't advance technology if you don't have a way to thrive and even create that technology. And all of that is fueled by fossil fuels. So where is that disconnect?
Well, I think there are, maybe four big issues where there's just pervasive miseducation. And so people don't really realize what you're saying in terms of they're crucial for our lives. So the basic, I think, four things would be: one is devaluing cost-effective energy. So thinking, oh, it's not that important. And that's just, we never talk about the value of energy. Like, look at everyone's goals as corporations. They're all focused on getting rid of CO2 emissions, but nobody's focused on empowering 8 billion people with cost-effective energy. So it just shows we devalue energy. And part of what we're saying here is energy is fundamental to human flourishing because it allows us to use machines to be productive and prosperous. So that's one thing. Two is the lack of energy in the world is not focused on. So the fact that 6 billion people use an amount of energy that we here would consider unacceptable, including 3 billion people using less electricity than a typical US refrigerator, right? So if you have people don't recognize the pervasive energy poverty. So one is they don't sufficiently value energy. Two is they're not aware of energy poverty. And then three is they're not aware of the unique cost effectiveness of fossil fuels. The fact fossil fuels are 80% of the world's energy, they're still growing, particularly in parts of the world like China that care most about cost-effective energy. So there's a lot of denial that somehow solar and wind can rapidly replace fossil fuels, whereas if that term energy transition is not true. There's no transition right now. There's an addition, and the addition has actually had a lot of problems in terms of cost and reliability of these alternatives. And it's just in electricity, which, that's only 1/5 currently of the world's energy. So there's just this false view that fossil fuels are easily replaceable. And that's reinforced by the first two, because if you don't care about energy that much and you don't realize how much more is needed, then it's plausible and you won't look into it too much. If you hear, oh yeah, solar and wind can do it, you won't think about it, right? Mm-hmm. Versus if energy is so valuable, if you think like my child's life depends on the state of energy, then you're going to be really concerned if somebody says, hey, let's get rid of this thing that provides 80% of the energy. And especially if the world needs 4 times more energy, at least in hopefully, as soon as possible, because it's so related to getting out of poverty. And then the fourth thing, of course, has to do with climate and the idea that using these fossil fuels is making the world unlivable through its climate impact. And there, my view is we impact climate, but we're not remotely making the world unlivable, because we make the world livable with the energy that comes with the CO2 emissions, including we're much safer than ever from climate because of the energy that comes from the CO2 emissions, because we can alleviate drought and we can have heating and air conditioning and we can build sturdy buildings and have weather warning systems. And so we're much better off with the energy, and that has far more positives, even climate-wise, than the CO2 does negative. And then also I think people exaggerate the negatives of the CO2 and they certainly ignore any of the positives of the CO2, even though they're fairly obvious, like more greening and then more warming in parts of the world that have way more cold-related deaths than heat-related deaths, which is the vast majority of the world. So it's those 4 things: devaluing energy, sort of not recognizing energy poverty, not recognizing the unique cost effectiveness of fossil fuels, and then believing in catastrophic climate impacts. And that's why Fossil Future is not coincidentally really based on that. So chapter 4 is about countering devaluing energy. Chapter 5 and 6 are about the unique cost effectiveness of fossil fuels, and as well as the state of energy poverty. And then chapter 7 through 9 are about how the actual impact on climate and how we're very good at dealing with climate using fossil fuels.
Yeah, no, that was perfectly summarized. And I think you're right in the sense that we're only going to worry about it once it's happening to us, once we start seeing how expensive it is, like Europe is seeing now, what life looks like without it, when you can't even heat up your home in the winters. And just that's when people start to realize, oh wait, we were like condemning this industry that the whole time was helping us live a better life. And like you mentioned, the energy poverty, with us being in North America, it's we have no idea how the rest of the world lives. And I think with, you know, with your point of energy poverty and really just like being open to like understanding and listening that that can happen if you don't, you know, wake up. That's I think when people really started looking into it, because there's billions of people, like you said, on the planet who are, like you said, they use less energy than a refrigerator in the US. And so I think that's really important, especially because over the last few years, even in the US and Canada, we don't want the industry to be drilling anymore. I mean, I grew up in Canada and in Alberta. When I started my career 10 years ago, we were drilling, it was awesome. And then now it's very dead. You know, it's come up again in the last few years, but we took a really big hit in Canada because people didn't want to exploit anymore and because it's bad. And but now I think with inflation and with just energy costs going up, I think people are going to start to realize that, hey, we need to get back into oil and gas because it's what we need to continue.
And it is important. I mean, it's true that this crisis is a big opportunity educationally, and I focused a lot on it. If you look at energytalkingpoints.com, there are a lot of articles about the crisis, but it also points to we need education to continue. Like you need to, so I've been talking about this for 15 years, including talking about, hey, if you do this, these policies, there's going to be this kind of crisis. It's important to do it continuously, not just when you're at the crisis point, because all these things to be really good require a long-term focus. Like you need smart people going into the industry, even on the recruiting side. You need that to be long-term. It can't just be, oh, you have a crisis and then you need a bunch of laborers in a rush. And you need long-term financial investment. And these are long-term projects in terms of production, and pipelines are long-term projects, and refiners are long-term projects. And so I think the industry now really needs to see, hey, if you want to be a long-term industry and benefit the world in a long-term way, and it's really needed because there's no alternative in the near future that can benefit the world. So if you don't, then we're all just going to suffer for lack of you. It needs to be a constant effort to push the value of this and policies that support it. It can't just be, oh, there's a crisis, let's fix it. Because a lot of politicians came to me, because I work with a lot of elected officials and I really like them in general, but kind of when prices started going up, everyone was asking, hey, what can we do this moment to make prices way lower? And it's like, well, there's only a limited number of things, because the thing that makes prices lower was, drilling
over a period of
years ago. And there, used to be that expression, like, you can't drill your way into prosperity. And in fact, you can, but you can't not drill your way into prosperity. And that's what has happened. It's just, everyone thought, oh, we can oppose fossil fuel investment, production, refining, transportation, and the prices seem okay now, so it's okay to do this. But no. You were screwing over the future, and the future is now.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm really glad that you pointed that out, Alex, because it's very true. And a lot of people don't understand even the permitting process and how there is so much government involvement in even getting the opportunity to drill. And those happen years before they even get to the site. And if those are closed down in this year, then next year you're going to see even worse, energy, price increase, because all of that backlog is going to be gone and there's no permitting and the process takes too long. So I'm really glad that you pointed that out. And so to close, Alex, is there one thing that, you'd like to leave our listeners with, anything that maybe we missed in our previous conversations? Because we really value your opinion and you coming on today.
Maybe something that would be useful, because I know you have a lot of advocates here, is just a certain idea in persuasion that I found very, very powerful, which is the idea that it's a two-part idea. One is that framing the conversation is both very powerful and quite easy to do. And so what I mean by framing the conversation, so the very quick version of this is your framework, just like a building has a framework, like every conversation, every thought process has a framework in the sense of a starting structure. So the basic structure of the thing determines almost everything else about it. And so when you have a conversation, you can think of it as there's a certain starting point in the conversation. And if you can engineer that to be better, then the rest of the conversation is going to be better. And to make that concrete, one of the ideas I focus on a lot, and I've focused on some here, is the idea that we need to carefully weigh the benefits and the side effects of any technology, including fossil fuels. So when I get in a conversation, I'll often say, would you agree that we should look carefully at not just the negative side effects of fossil fuels, but also the benefits? And everyone will say yes. Or sometimes I'll do it. I'll just tell my own story and I'll just say, hey, when I was looking at this, I realized that people didn't seem to be looking at the benefits. And so I wanted to look at both benefits and negative side effects. And when you frame it, there are other things to frame, but that's the easiest one and maybe the most powerful immediately. Like when you frame it that way, people think so much more rationally about it. Because left to their own devices, because the culture and educational system are so bad on this issue, people will only look at negative side effects. So notice even the way people talk about the issue is climate change, right? Climate change. But that's the alleged negative side effect of it. So even in framing it as climate change, you're not talking about the benefits of energy. So it's so badly framed that people don't think about the benefits of energy. And so the best way I found to do it is to make that explicit and just say, hey, do you agree we need to look at the benefits too? Because if you just talk about the benefits and don't frame it, they won't really be prepared for it and they won't have agreed to even think about the benefits. But if you can frame it, it's a lot better. So if you ever kind of see, I wish I could kind of tape my conversations one-on-one, because I actually think that's the thing I'm best at, is persuading people who expect to disagree one-on-one, but they're not usually comfortable if you just record the conversation with them and they don't know you. But someday I'll make that happen, or I'll just go on the street and talk to people. But I use a lot of framing, and when you frame it well, it helps them think about it better. It makes you come across in a good way. It's particularly important if you're in the industry, because there is a suspicion when you're in an industry. It's easy to overcome, but it's a suspicion that, okay, well, you're just talking your own book. You're just saying this thing. And so part of overcoming that is framing it in a way that everyone can agree with. Another thing I would say, it's more controversial, is really try to be objective about all forms of energy. So in the realm of alternatives, like solar and wind, I should say, it means not being, or EVs is another example, like not being blanket pro, but not being blanket con. So not saying like, oh yeah, we love this, all of the above, it's great. Or this is terrible, it'll never work in any form. It's like, no, we want cost-effective energy for the most people. And so we're in favor of this where it's actually a cost-effective solution. I think it's important for solar, wind, especially important for nuclear. It's very important to be very open to nuclear, because nuclear is very concentrated energy, like even more so than fossil fuels. So it should be very exciting. And then also coal. I really have an issue with oil and gas demonizing coal, because coal is really the best hope in the near future for billions of people. And so you can say, yeah, we want to expand natural gas. That's great. But that's really about alleviating energy poverty. It's not about getting rid of coal. So I disagree with this idea that we're going to expand natural gas and get rid of coal. I think we should expand natural gas to empower more people. We're not nearly at the point where enough people have energy to be getting rid of things. And if you say get rid of coal, you mean get rid of their standard of living. Like no rich person in the rich world should feel comfortable saying, hey, this thing that poor people are using to get by, like, let's get rid of that. You should be very uncomfortable saying that. You can say, I'm going to offer some of them a better deal, or I'm going to offer more of them this. But so that's, and I think the more you come across as a really about energy improving human life and about thinking about it in an even-handed, fair way, then you'll really win over people. And what people will see as a final note is they'll see that you're not advocating, say, oil and gas because you're in that industry. You're in that industry because you honestly believe in it, just like you believe in these other sources of energy. I think if you can do that, then it's very, very credible.
Alex, that was fabulous. That was a really great ending and just great educational piece. Where can people find you? I know we talked about energytalkingpoints.com and your books, but what about LinkedIn? Where are you at?
So yeah, energytalkingpoints.com, and I have a newsletter there, so I highly recommend that as probably the number one thing. Obviously, Fossil Future, moral case for fossil fuels is behind me, but you don't need to get that anymore. Just get Fossil Future. It replaces moral case for fossil fuels. And I am on LinkedIn, so you just search Alex Epstein. I'm on Twitter at Alex Epstein. I'm on Instagram, which I started doing fairly recently, Alex Epstein Energy. And I guess I'm on Facebook.com/The Pursuit of Energy. So I kind of post the same stuff on all of them. So whatever platform you like, do that. And then I would just say also, what else is there? I guess, I have just a personal website, alexepstein.com. So if you're interested in anything about me, you can find it there, including I think there's stuff about like how to book me for media and how to book me as a speaker and that kind of thing. So if you need to find anything, alexepstein.com. And there's also, sorry, one more thing, fossilfuture.com. If you want to get the book, I've basically too many websites. If you want to get Fossil Future, and in particular, if you want to get it in bulk for employees, that has all the links for it, including bulk discounts. That's just why I wanted to single that out.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Alex.
Guys.
And lastly, I want to add, if you need some more educational pieces too, we have Fun Fact Friday. Go to our LinkedIn, and we put facts about the oil and gas industry every Friday, supported by Liberty. So yeah, y'all tune into that too. So thank you. Thank you, Alex.